Hey guys, welcome back to another Default Cube CG Matter tutorial, and in this one I'm going to be showing you how to make these cool looking rings that look right out of a Ducky 3D tutorial, and you may be thinking, oh, that's kind of cool, I guess, but the nice thing about this is I've set up a controller, in other words, an empty object, and what it does is when we move it, you see it kind of changes this mesh procedurally. It has this kind of jitter effect that's random, but it also looks kind of smooth if you look at this or we're going to call this the wireframe. So we have the donut, which is this, and then the wireframe on top of that. So you can see the wireframes moving pretty smoothly. And then we can also go to rendered mode and you see, I made materials, but that's not what I'm going to show you in this tutorial. So let's talk about how to create this mesh around it that can procedurally be animated by a controller that, by the way, you can move around anywhere you want, and the speed that you move it controls the speed of this. And yeah, we want to talk about how to do that. Works with every model, whatever. Let's start. So start up a new Blender project, and you can use whatever model you want for this, but generally the more geometry it has, the better it's going to be. So something like a cube that only has 6 faces, technically it will work, yeah, but it's going to look stupid. It's going to look lame. So let's instead use a torus. And you can use a monkey. I don't care. So with our torus, we're going to set this to shade smooth. And at this point, you need to decide, do you want only the object or the do you want only the mesh or the wireframe, whatever we're going to call it, that thing that we're going to be animating? Do you want only the wireframe, or do you want the object with the wireframe on top? So you kind of have the solid and then the, I don't know, the exosuit. I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. For this, I'm going to show you how to do both, but it's essentially the same process. So take your model. We're also going to duplicate it, so either Control-C, Control-V, or Shift-D to duplicate, and we're just going to right-click, so you can see we have a torus 001 and torus. So with torus 001, we're just going to start adding some modifiers. So the first one, go to the Modifiers tab. You might have expected it. It is a wireframe modifier. So again, you need to remember these are two objects. It's not one object that you can see the donut and then also the wireframe. It's two different objects. So, this is what it looks like with only the shell. And with our torus 001, which I'm going to call wireframe, we can control this in the ways that you might expect. We can control the thickness of this, whatever. We can make it smoother, whatever. But generally, the only thing we care about is the thickness. But I'm just going to keep it as default. So the next question is, how do we get that nice, not, uniform looking wireframe? Right now, this just kind of looks very orderly, and there's no triangulation, and it's not random, and it doesn't look jittery. So the next step is we're going to add a decimate modifier. So add in a decimate, and we want this on top. So first of all, let's talk about what this does. I'm just going to quickly delete the wireframe. So with the decimate modifier, what it's going to do is it's going to take our geometry, and depending on this number, it's going to create new geometry that should have less faces. So it's a way to optimize but also get very ugly geometry. So if I bring this down, you can see it's doing some weird stuff to our mesh. In edit mode, it doesn't do anything, but when we apply, you see that our geometry, if we get rid of the other, if we only look at, getting them confused, if we only look at this one, you can see it messes up our geometry, which in this case is what we want since it's going to mess with our modifier. So let's just bring everything back and make sure we don't have that modifier deleted. So now that you know what the decimate does. So again, make sure your decimate is on top using this arrow on top of the wireframe. And then all we have to do is drag this, and you can see we're getting different effects. And the lower we go, kind of the lower resolution we have, so there's not going to be many wires. And you may be thinking, okay, we kind of already have this controlled. We just keyframe this ratio, and then we have a jittering thing. But the issue is it only goes between 0 and 1. So even if we animate it going down, eventually we're going to run out of room to play with, and it's going to get too low res. So the question is, how do we keep whatever resolution? So let's say this resolution, how do we keep it, but also have it animate? And there's a couple tricks I learned. The first one, which is the bad method, is using a wave modifier, which we're going to put on top. And what this normally does is, it makes a wave. So what it's doing is it's taking our donut, making it wave, then it's going to decimate it, and then it's going to wireframe it. And you may be thinking, okay, how do we make this work? Well, the trick is you set the height to, if you set it to 0, it's just going to freeze. But if you set it to something like 0.001, it's going to look like it's in place and do this animation, this flickering, and you can control the speed and everything else. But I find that this kind of gives very jittery results even when you play with this other stuff. So instead, what I've discovered, I mean, I'm sure somebody else found it, but what I've personally discovered is using that, what am I saying? Using a displace modifier is the way to go. And you may think, oh, what have I done? How's this the way to go? Remember, it's decimating, taking a wireframe, and now we are displacing afterwards, which is not what we want. We want to displace as the first thing we do. So displace, decimate, wireframe. Okay, so with our displace, what we're going to do is you can already mess with these settings so it doesn't look weird, but the way the displace modifier works is it does our displacement based off a texture. So we want our texture to be noisy, and then we want to kind of animate this noise, which will do what we want. So enough talking, let's just do it. Click this new button to add a new texture. We can call it noise text for noise texture. Then go to the texture panel, which eventually is probably going to leave Blender. It's probably on its last stages and nobody uses it anymore. It's kind of a legacy, but here's what you do. So with a noise text, you can select your type. Right now it's set to image, which is nothing since we don't have an image. So you can pick any of these noises. They're all going to give different results. It really does not matter what you pick. I'm just going to pick clouds because that's pretty standard. And we want to make this kind of still be noisy but not as intense. And you can either do that by messing with settings here to control, here we have kind of very low frequency large clouds, or we can have high frequency clouds. So you can either mess with it here and mess with these results, or back in the modifier. Our displace also has a couple options. So the strength of the displacement, when this is 0, it's going to be normal. And then we just want to bring it up a bit. And notice that it's going to cut into our geometry if we do too much. So I recommend something like 0.1. And this will kind of depend on your model. And then you can also set your mid-level, which you can think of as if your displacement has a base level, and then it's going to displace up and down from that, where do you want your base level to be? Which is to say, what thickness is our donut going to be before displacing? So you just want to pick whatever value makes sense for your situation. And again, you can also, instead of doing that, just modify the cloud texture directly. But we now have something that works, but if we play this, it's not animated. And, you could export a animated cloud noise texture and use that as our image or movie. It's pretty stupid. It's not what you want to do. So what I would recommend is a nice trick is with texture coordinates, which is how it's going to tell. This is how Blender knows how to put that cloud texture on our donut, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to set this to object, which if you don't know, object coordinates are dependent on the origin of some object. Doesn't have to be our donut. In this case, we're going to make it an empty such that when we move it, everything works. So set this to object, Shift A to add a new anything. It can be a cube, it can be a plane, just anything with an origin. Let me just prove the point. Here we have a plane. Here you can see the origins right there. So this is the only thing we care about. The geometry doesn't matter. So we can pick this, set our object to be the plane, and now when we move the plane, everything works. If we move it slowly, it's going to look more jittery. And if we move it fast, it's just going to look like a wave almost. So it works with anything with an origin. I'm just going to set it to empty since it's less distracting and you're kind of used to using empties as empty controllers. So let's set that right there and you see it works. And the nice thing about this is since it's procedural in some sense, right? All it's really doing is taking a location and then taking our geometry and just applying modifiers with the procedural cloud texture. This technique works with any model like we talked about. We can also control this intensity and still get the same effect. It looks weird, but maybe you could find a use for this maybe. Or you could control the kinds of clouds, or maybe you want to use a wood noise texture. There's all different types of possibilities here. And then, of course, like we talked about, wireframe, you can increase the thickness. And then, everything still works. So maybe one more modifier you might want to consider. If this is too low res for you and you're getting shading issues, you can either add in a bevel or a subsurf. Now, there's a chance this is going to crash, but hopefully it doesn't. Subsurf. Basically, the more geometry you have, the more dangerous this is going to be. But what subsurf is going to do is it's going to smooth everything out. And it's going to freeze. Hopefully it didn't freeze the recording, but basically what it's doing is it's the same thing as before, just nice and smooth. I wonder if a way to make this work, since we have this procedural approach is taking our decimate and bringing it down, so we're going to have a lower resolution wireframe. Let's see if that now works. Nope. That's the thing. Once you have too much geometry, you're kind of lost. So let me just get rid of that. Alternatively, you could also use a bevel, but just proving a point. And then I guess, you know what? It's a tutorial. I'll give the full thing. So here's how we do the shading. Nothing's fancy. We're in Eevee. Go to rendered mode. For the donut, make one material. For the wireframe, make another material. For the donut, we're going to get rid of the BSDF and just go straight for an emission, even though emission is now inside BSDF, but that's fine. You can choose a color, or you can choose multiple colors by having a layer weight node, which is going to kind of look like this, right? So you can see it kind of goes from gray to white depending on the viewing angle, or you can use facing is another way you can do that. Let me just hide this, if you see what I mean. So what we can do is use this as our factor for a color ramp node. There's a bunch of ways to do this. Color ramp's probably the way to go though. Color goes into emission, emission into surface. Okay, and then you just want to choose colors that don't suck. Maybe like a blue, and then you can choose your white surrounding. So maybe a related color, like some green next to it. Something like that. Or of course you can use Fresnel to get a different effect. And you can control this with the blend. Okay, so since we're using Eevee, just turn on bloom. You know, get nice bloom, make it more emissive. It's going to be more intense. Unhide the wireframe. And then for the wireframe, what I did, again, this isn't a material tutorial, but what I recommend is setting it to something darker, making it shinier maybe, or you can make it more metallic depending on, you know, really what you're going for. But, you know, there you go. You have this cool looking sci-fi donut thing that's nice and animated. This works with any model. Like I said, more geometry the better, but it's just a stack of modifiers. And the nice thing about this is since it's in modifiers, everything we did, we can always take this, both of them. You know what, let's do it without the donut, just the wireframe, which, you know, still works. We can always take this, duplicate it, and it's going to change when we move it because it's in reference to our empty, which means it's moving away from it, so it's going to change. If you want to fix that, you got to change over to a different coordinate system like UV coordinates. But what you can do is just move these around. So something like that. And our empty, as you expect, is going to animate both. If you don't want that, what we can do is duplicate our empty. Second wireframe, you then just change the object coordinates to use the other empty. So now we have one controller and another controller. That's pretty cool, right? Yeah, I don't know. But there you go. That's a tutorial. It's just kind of like a modifier methodology tutorial. And yeah, hopefully you found it helpful. If you enjoyed this tutorial, the best way to support me and to make sure I can keep making tutorials and hopefully move out very soon and pay rent and everything, the best way to help me out is via Patreon. I really appreciate anybody who wants to effectively donate, but you also get benefits. Recently, I posted some motion tracking footage, and I'm going to start doing Patreon exclusive tutorials as well, or some version of that. Maybe whatever, I'm not going to talk about it right now, but if you want to support me, Patreon is the best way to do that. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you on the next one.